So, how should Australia protect itself from the growing threat that is China? China is very big, and Australia, as a military power, really quite small. And for us, of course, that spells danger, especially now that China's dictator, Xi Jinping, has made China so much more aggressive. And with China now spending on defence skyrocketing to nearly $250 billion a year. Makes you wonder, why does it want a military that big? And so, what would Australia do if China ever did one day confront us? Who would help us? Who could? Well, here is one idea. Build a US naval base in Australia. That's the idea of James Holmes, Chair of Maritime Strategy at the US Naval War College. He's a naval war veteran and the author of A Brief Guide to Maritime Strategy. I spoke to him earlier. James Holmes, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Why do you think the United States should build a naval base in Australia?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, I give a variety of reasons. First of all, if you just look at the map, if you look at the map, the United States is basically based at the far end of what we call the Indo-Pacific theater at Japan and the far west in the Persian Gulf region. There's very little that we have along that arc between Bahrain and between Japan. And Australia lies not only right at the middle of that arc, but also just south of the South China Sea, obviously an embattled zone for us. And it just makes strategic logic for us to put maritime forces where we can move them from side to side, from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean to whatever the case may be, whatever the contingency may arise. So geographically, it makes perfect sense.
Well, what's wrong with expanding your facilities in Singapore or in South Korea?
Well, I mean, South Korea doesn't really give us a whole lot more over Yokosuka and over Sasebo in Japan. So that really doesn't help too much. Singapore, obviously, being right there on the Malacca Strait, is very reluctant to take sides as far as admitting a serious maritime force like a carrier strike group or an amphibious rescue group or something like that. Also, they also happen to be within that arc and thus more closer into the danger zone vis-a-vis China. Chinese ballistic missiles, Chinese weaponry of all sorts. So from a purely American standpoint, Australia is an even better option than Singapore, although I think we would work with them as well.
Well, as soon as you raise the fact that Singapore is a little bit in the danger zone, opponents of American bases in Australia might say, well, look, your proposal would make us a target. Why is it in Australia's interest to be host to an American naval base?
Well, simply because Australia is increasingly on the front lines as China tries to make itself into the leading power in the Indo-Pacific region and ultimately somewhere down the road the world. Ultimately, Australia is going to need friends, powerful friends within the region, and I think the United States is well positioned to provide that. So I'm just basically calling for allied unity and tightening up the alliance to something like it was in decades past when things were also really bad during the Cold War and then obviously the Second World War before that.
Should we consider this in our interest in two ways? One, that we have an enhanced American capability in a region that we need defended. That's one. But second, also that we sort of have hostages to fortune. While the US has a base here, it will be more inclined to come to our aid should we need it. It has skin in the game.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if you think about what it says, that when we put American lives, American military hardware, all those resources in a particular place, that shows that, like you said, we have skin in the game. Skin in the game means that we would be almost certain to honor our commitment to Australia when the ships are really down, and also in peacetime. I mean, let's keep in mind we're talking about deterrence in peacetime, preferably. If we make a show of common capability and a show of common purpose, we much increase our prospects of deterring China from doing things that we would like to forbid.
Now, you know what war is like. You've served in war. You've been a naval gunner. Looking though at the geopolitical landscape now. We're talking about China, obviously. The threat from China is the #1 issue for you and for us. How serious do you think that danger is? What are the chances of war?
Oh boy, I certainly hate to just start putting numbers on prospects. The great baseball philosopher Yogi Berra said that it's really tough to make predictions, especially about the future. I don't think it's all that likely, but I think it would be even less likely if we can make that show of common capability, military capability in my case, which is what I'm calling for, and then honor that common purpose, which shows that we would stand together if China continues to try to upend the international system in the South China Sea. Potentially take territory, attack Taiwan, or whatever the case may be. So my guess is that it's not all that likely, but we can hold that prospect down even further by making that show of common power and purpose.
Fascinating. Professor James Holmes, thank you so much indeed for your time.
And thank you.
That's the thing. War is more likely when you look weak and friendless. It's much less likely when you look strong and with some powerful people behind you. Something to note.